Alright, hello everybody, welcome to our next lesson here. Today we're going to talk about the culture of African Americans, kind of following the American Revolutionary War and everything like that. So our objectives and standards for today: to understand how African Americans kept their culture alive, and to analyze the impact of individual and groups of African Americans. Take a moment there to read the standards. So our desired result: what elements of culture and society did African Americans have an impact on? So keeping culture alive, plantation owners are going to be concerned that the traditions of African Americans could cause rebellion. Sorry about the typo there, should be a capital A there. Slave owners are going to refuse the practice of African American traditions and culture, but even though they refuse this on their slaves, African American slaves are going to continue to practice traditions and customs in secret. So the role of religion. During the 1600s and the 1700s, many Christians used arguments from the Bible, again, should be capital there, to justify slavery. However, not all whites are going to accept these interpretations. Many people see owning slaves as immoral or unchristian. So some white people in the country at this time are going to say that this is not right, while others who own the slaves obviously are going to use the Bible to justify their claims that you can have slaves. There's going to be heated disagreements over this, but whether they agreed or disagreed about the interpretation of the Bible and slavery, all of them felt that African Americans should be baptized Christian. So because of this, slaves are not going to be allowed to practice any other religion, including Islam. Again, capitalization there. But that should be what many African Americans were practicing, or may have been practicing, if they were practicing any religion at all at the time. Now, owners of slaves are not going to allow African Americans to read the Bible or have prayer meetings. The reason for this is they're afraid that if they read the Bible, they'll maybe read about, stories in the Bible of slaves being freed or slaves running away or things like that. So they don't want that to get that in their head. They also don't want slaves to have prayer meetings because they're afraid at prayer meetings, slaves could plan a rebellion or an escape. So churches of African Americans, even though they were prohibited from attending religious service, African Americans are going to form their own churches. In the North, for example, some African Americans attended white churches, but they had to sit in separate sections. Most African Americans are going to form Baptist churches in the South. Now, one of the big figures of this movement is Richard Allen. Richard Allen helped form the African Methodist Episcopal, or the AME Church, in 1787, and many African American churches and congregations are going to form the center of freedom efforts for others. So, schools and African Americans. Most African Americans knew that the best way to better themselves was through education. Now, although the parents of African American children are going to try to send them to school or get them an education, many whites are going to deny this. But there are examples of African Americans providing education in other ways, such as Paul Cuffe, who you see here, in Primus Hall. Paul Cuffe actually educated his children and built a school for other African American children as well. Primus Hall actually taught children out of his house as well. African American citizens of Boston are going to build their own school for children. Um, Not despite, but in including to African Americans building their own schools, Quakers are going to accept African American students in the North. Now, some Southerners, actually some Southern owners or Southern women, agreed to teach reading and writing to African Americans, and some teachers will teach in the South, but again, the fear in the South of educated African Americans kept many from gaining an education in general. So advancements in other areas. Lucy Terry, her picture's up here, was the first known African-American poet. She actually wrote of the massacre near Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1746. You may know this woman's name, Phyllis Wheatley. She was a young Boston slave who was the first to have her poetry published. She actually learned how to read and write from the wealthy wife and daughter of her owner, and her first poem was published in 1767, and she had her first book published in London in 1773, and she will basically be declared a genius for her writings. So other advancements, science and medicine also saw improvements by African Americans. The greatest scientist of the American Revolutionary War was Benjamin Banneker. He was actually born free, and he was educated in a Quaker school. He became skilled in mathematics and engineering, and Banneker was actually praised by others, including Thomas Jefferson, and he's best remembered for surveying or kind of designing Washington, D.C., the city of Washington, D.C. a little bit. Another influential African American was James Durham. He will be the first African American doctor in the United States. Now, he was formerly a slave who learned from his owner, and he will open his own successful practice in Philadelphia, PA. Alright, so again, our closure. What elements in culture and society did African Americans have an impact on? Think about schools, religion, think about some of the different advancements they're making in writing and literature, also in science and mathematics, and that will help you answer your question. Alright, I hope you have a great rest of your day or night, and hope to talk to you all soon.